Yeah. Okay, then let's make a start, shall we? Okay, so we are live, and welcome everybody to the last in a series of talks for this academic year. We're thrilled to have you to see us off with what will be a really enjoyable talk, I'm sure. We have no announcements other than please do make sure to follow us on Twitter and check out all of our recorded content, which can be found on our YouTube channel. And you can also see slides which will be posted on our OSF page as well. So because there's no announcements, we could get straight onto the main event, and I think we're all eagerly anticipating the event. We're today joined by Dr. James Heathers. A quick bio of James. He did complete his PhD in 2014 in cardiac psychophysiology at the University of Sydney. He then became a postdoc at Poznan University of Medical Sciences, researching electrocardiology, and then he took a postdoc position at Northeastern University in Boston, where he worked with Professor Matthew Goodwin on biosignals and meta-scientific research. His work focused on data science and personal health informatics, broadly speaking. In mid-2020, James did what we all secretly dream of doing, which is quit lit, and he took a position with CypherSkin, a startup developing a network of wraparound sensors that captures and visualizes movement with particular utility in big data diagnostics. James is perhaps best known for being the second part of a duo on the Everything Hurts podcast with Dan Quintana, and also being a data thug and an all-around scourge of error with Nick Brown, and has won a SIPS Mission Award for his work with Nick Brown on Sprite and Grim and other issues with error detection. So James, I'm going to hand the keys over to you. Thank you again for joining us today, and very much look forward to your talk. And thanks again for joining us at a ridiculous o'clock.
Yeah, my pleasure. You hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Rock and roll. Okay, I have to say this is we're already dealing from a quality deck here, because I've had less accurate introductions from people who are supposed to do this for money previously. That was, yeah, didn't leave anything out. That's me, and here I am, and this is Tomfuckery Redux, a title which had to be formally approved, by the way, and thank you for approving it. It's also thoroughly irrelevant to the introduction, but we'll get to that. Let's go. So, as the nice man said, this is my job. I don't think my PhD was in 2014. It's when I finished. It took them a very long time to market. I thought it was 2016, but it's almost like you leave academia and those details aren't as important anymore. Anyway, it's a while ago. Postdoc, research scientist, all of it in and around cardiac signals, blah, wearable devices, etc. Not talking about any of it. The company, if you're interested, very briefly, cool hardware, leg sleeve, cool software, tracking the movement, persecuted engineer on the right-hand side. Yes, that's not actually a PT patient. It's our chief engineer. We got to poke him around the gym with a fork for a while until we got the right kind of graphics. So within this, this is a startup. I get a fancy title, which helps. CSO stands for Chief Scientific Officer. That will be minimally relevant later. Anyway, we're not talking about it. Likewise, everything else where you may potentially have heard of something that I've done. I'm not going to cover anything in error detection today. That's the first slide there. That's my favorite Nick Brown meme. He gave a talk for a different RIOT club. I think it was in March. And he went through pretty much everything we've done together. So that's redundant, and his attention to detail is better than mine. So if you want to know how that works, you should probably watch his talk. Dan isn't here, so it isn't a podcast. I have some other things I've done. I have a silly Twitter account that mocks preclinical research for being represented as actual clinical research, which I find funny. The big joke of there being the account is called Just Says in Mice and the logo is a rat. I thought I would get months of pleasure before anyone noticed that. Instead, it took about 2 hours because it turns out people who use animal models actually know what they're talking about. And I started a little movement where I insisted that as I'm enjoying my experience as a new capitalist, that I wanted to get paid to do peer review, which raised a certain series of kerfuffles in a variety of contexts. None of this is immediately relevant, but everything that we're going to talk about is in some ways drawn from all of this shaken up in a bag. So I give a lot of talks in a lot of different contexts, and I wanted to do something that was new. I didn't want to talk about this again, which is one of the curses of saying things in public. Eventually it becomes tired. So I have a certain amount of trepidation about moving into the material that I'm moving into, but with the confidence of a mediocre white man, we will soldier ahead and we will see how we can do. And we will talk about not the specifics of things going wrong within the academy, but more about the kind of macro scale phenomena involved, centered around a specific example, which I assure you is something that you've heard of. So I suppose the reason for this perspective change is that a sentence I didn't think I'd get to say in my lifetime is that I have spent the last year trying to help run a business. Even if you are I graduated myself from baby executive to infant executive a while ago. So, you know, I'm still mostly pre-verbal, but we're figuring it out. It requires access to a certain category of ideas, certain kinds of thoughts, to be able to help think about how do we put this thing that we do in a broader marketplace. And it's been really interesting. One of the most interesting parts has not been the thing itself, it's been the reflections of that particular experience on everything that I used to do and still somewhat do, and everything all of you presumably still do. So different experiences change your thinking. So question, what's the right framework for trying to understand global problems in academia? That's the big tomfuckery bucket. So let's open that box with a really boring slide. These are concepts that have primacy in my mind when I'm trying to think about and structure all of the thoughts that I have about how this business/industry is organized. Most of them are drawn from civics and economics, of which I am at least 15 years out of date in a formal training sense, but they quite well inform many of the issues that we've got. You've probably heard of these. Regulatory capture is reasonably straightforward. Some entities in the world are regulated when they have a strong influence over the regulation of themselves, then that's referred to as regulatory capture. It's usually given in the concept of government. It's a concept from civics. It gets a lot of play in the United States, as might be expected. There is a quick example for fun. Let's say you are a logging company and you cut down trees and sell the wood for money. And the Department of Land and Environment gives you everything that you want because you mean a great deal to the region or the state or the local community, etc., etc. Hang the environmental consequences, let the hills slide into the rivers because of deforestation, etc., etc. So the interests of the regulated party are served by the regulators. I said it was a simple concept, bureaucratic inertia. Not only are you immediately familiar with this if you have ever seen a university from across a street, but it's also self-descriptive. Meta-regulation is a little bit more interesting. A process by which risk management is managed as a risk management plan, not as a regulatory structure. So This is not always a bad thing. It just turns out to be in some cases. I promise you all of these will become relevant. That is the boringest slide I got, so might as well keep going. The main body of this talk is going to be centered around how we try to apply a kind of a market understanding, I suppose, to something that everyone else is familiar with here. So everyone knows what an impact factor is. If you haven't seen the equation for a while, this would be the one that is in graphics that have just been put up to describe what's happening for the journal impact factors for 2020. So citations in the calendar year of 2020 of publications that were formally published in 2018, 2019, divided by the total number of research items. Now, research items, make a mental note of that. That's going to become relevant later. Everyone knows what this is. Doesn't need any more context. So I tried counting the amount of papers that say the impact factor is a terrible idea. They go back a very long way. There is a lot of them. And I feel like to a certain degree, I'm the only clown that's read them. There is an incredibly well-developed field of what's called Scientometrics, which is largely research done by librarians, which is the academic study of academic metrics, as might be expected. I think it's awesome. It's very, very interesting, especially if you've had the research background that I have. I find the whole thing, the whole field, incredibly compelling, and I think it's tremendously underutilized and underappreciated within the kind of broader research environment. Within Scientometrics, of course, everyone has lined up to punch the impact factor in the teeth for as long as it's existed for a variety of reasons, some of which you're also probably familiar with. Now, access to impact factors at a database level is restricted. It's part of the Web of Science offering. In general, if you have access to that, I don't anymore, your institution buys it for you. It is part of a package that they buy from Clarivat Analytics. So you have it and I don't, which is weird that I'm talking about it. How they're actually calculated is irreproducible. And I know that because I've tried to count all of the citations of the relevant publications within a time period and see if I can get the same number just for fun. You can get close. Obviously, if the impact factor is 3.5 and you calculate it up yourself, you will get 3.2 or 3.8. You won't get 40. So you get an approximation, but you'll never get the actual thing itself. So we don't know where they're from. It is a closed metric. But put all the academic things to one side and realize first that this is a product. It is a product that is calculated by a company for money and then sold. That's the primary reason it exists. The secondary reason it exists is that it's a metric that still unaccountably determines a great deal about how academic life is valued and structured, et cetera, et cetera. So a brief history. Let me turn this goddamn phone off. My apologies. It is early. So Garfield came up with it in the 60s as the intellectual property of a company called ISI until started in 1975. The company was bought by Thomson. Thomson became Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters spun off Clarivat as a separate analytic department, sold it to private equity firms, which I think was Barings Asia and Onyx. And that was merged into Churchill Capital Fund 1, which is a special acquisitions company with an investment vehicle, basically. It's a blank slate company where you make investments and then the company buys an enormous asset. So it's a kind of a stealthy, modern-ish way for acquiring an entire company. So I don't remember what the sum was. It's probably a nine-figure sum, and that was as recently as 2019. So the chairman of the Clarivat Analytics company is whoever was the director of that SPAC, Churchill Capital 1. They raise different tranches over time. So that is far more from my world now than it is from yours. We are talking about a analytic product that is owned by a company who bought it specifically for the purpose of making money at a very serious corporate level. This is not my startup world. This is big boy shit. There are hundreds of millions of dollars involved in these acquisitions at an absolute minimum a lot of the time. So I thought you'd be interested to see, when you have a special acquisition company and you buy or merge with another company, you're forced to make an SEC filing, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. So here's the slide from the SEC filing. You can see on the bottom right, Churchill Capital Corp, Clarivate Analytics. Here's the slide from the SEC filing. Now, and hopefully now we're getting to stuff that no one's ever shown you before. So these are the buckets into which this is represented as a product level: predictable and highly resilient recurring revenue streams, proprietary must-have offerings, incremental margin growth, and build once, sell many times model. Yeah, corporate jargon, sure, but what does that mean in context? Well, it means that they have the history of how this is constructed, and you have to buy it. That's what a predictable and highly resilient recurring revenue streams means. It's like if you're the only tarmac company in a county that has continual road degradation. It is necessary. When they say it's a must-have offering, they mean it's a must-have offering. Basically that. You have to buy it. That's why it makes a good acquisition for someone who has hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, obviously, we're not just talking about the impact factor when it comes to something like this. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's in the big Web of Science bucket that are analytical services that they offer to research institutes, universities, etc. But that's generally what they mean. So, a quick diversion, if I can figure out how to do this on the screen here. There you go, little fella. Come on. Come on. Nope, 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 nope. Okay. So we got a chat window here. That's fun. We're going to start the most successful journal in the world. Now, there's 62 people here. I am going to leave this room and get a can of seltzer because Denver is very dry. What are our strategies? Hit me up. We're going to start the most successful journal in the world from scratch. And I don't mean what topic is it going to be on. What's the academic area that it will surround? So don't pick anything. How should we do that? If you've got any ideas, pop them in the chat window. I'm legitimately leaving the room for 60 seconds, so I won't see you type it.
So if you want to add anything, you can put it in the Q&A. I think James is talking about the chat that we can only see between me, James, and Ian. So if you want to add it into the Q&A.
I ruined that then, haven't I?
That's
okay.
fine. That's okay.
Sorry, I thought it was a meeting chat. There was a meeting chat with everyone.
And no, it's my fault. I should have said before. The other disadvantage of this is that there is like a 10 to 20 second delay. So they'll be hearing your request in about 5 seconds time. So there will be it's not going to be immediate, but we've got a few people anyway. Whilst people are just submitting their ideas, Nick Brown is asked to let you know that he's in the audience. So he said old Nick Brown is watching. So there you go.
I'm old Nick. I got statistics.
I'll put you back on the screen, James. So we can see people already. So James, if you want to reorient your gaze then to the Q&A option, can you see that?
Got it.
Yeah. So you'll see new and published. So I'll just quickly publish the ones because we moderate it, you see, just in case we get any So yeah, can you see the published window option?
Yes, I can.
Perfect.
Okay, so these are good suggestions. Go back in time to Imperial Britain. Superb idea. Minor problem with the physics. Only publish review and meta-analyses. Nailed it. Extremely good. Make it open access. Also works. Open access MDPI style. Yeah, a bit dodgy. Encourage big names to submit. Publish findings that aid powerful institutions in these goals. This is good. Okay. Excellent. Excellent work. RIOT of Wolverhampton. That's it. All of those are bang on the money. No one said, of course. No one said, of course, do good science. We seem to be confining ourselves to. Oh dear, I don't know who you are, Dogus, but I owe you a beer. Publish journalist bait counterintuitive stuff. Publish items which cite other articles but do not count as research items. Joe, you too. Format free, beautiful. Join a big publishing group, only accept groundbreaking submissions. This is excellent. Okay, all of these things, every single thing that you've mentioned, that's probably the best Q&A response I've ever gotten. All of these things are regarded as impact factor manipulating tactics. I tried counting them up, and I got to, which you've probably already seen because I can't manage my damn slides properly, 14. They cross publication mechanics. How do we handle the content of the journal on a macro level? Citation behavior, obvious. Content strategies, what do we choose to include? Author strategies, what authors do we pursue? I think all of those are reflected in here somewhere. So we'll go through them real fast because I'm obviously dealing with people who know what they're talking about here. Okay. The first way, publication delay. Publish something online in mid-2016. Figure out how to actually put it in the volume and issue of the journal, which doesn't have a paper counterpart anymore. That means it needs to be confined to a volume or issue. Marvelous dodge. Paper gets 18 months of free citations before it's published. Now, they just changed this in the 2020 impact factors. And finally got wise to this incredibly obvious factor that's been going on for a million years, and they decided to do something about it. Front loading is an interesting one. Not a lot of people have heard of this, but it makes perfect sense. If you publish something in January, you publish something in December, they're treated the same way. So you've got a much more calendar year to run it out. Now, maybe you can't, or that's difficult to organize, but how about a nice special edition in our journal at the very first issue of the year? Maybe a special edition that benefits from some of the other strategies that we'll be talking about in a second. Strategic open access is a good one as well. Let's say you have a closed access journal because you sell it for money and that's part of your business model. If you have something that is particularly popular, or is showing particular changes in its metrics over time, you can just choose to make that particular article open access. As someone very correctly said in the chat, open access journals in general are cited more simply because there's better basic access to the material. Even if people are citing it in a flyby kind of way, it's easier to locate and understand and cite. And of course, there's a Matthew effect that starts with that more or less immediately. Other people see it being cited, the citations begin to accrue, etc. So strategic open access is a good one. That's a little bit sneaky. Citation behavior, of course. These are all much dodgier. And people have been pinged for these. There's a couple of good stories on the COPE website about people who've been busted trying to pull these off. Within journal citations, really straightforward. You publish for journal X, they review your paper and say, what about including more articles from journal X? I think that this thing on irradiant pottery is directly relevant to your quantum physics. Let's put that in. I make a distinction between that and what's called final mile citation, which is when you wait until the paper's almost done and then you request these inclusions. So there's a kind of a social coercion factor that is going into that as well. It's meaner in a way. It's using the leverage of we're just about to publish your stuff to try and get the extra citations in. And citation cartels are are pretty straightforward. Sometimes citation rings, everyone mutually cites each other. Those citations are external, they don't appear as within journal citations, which the impact factor people obviously watch out for. If they're not too egregious, it's probably going to work to a certain degree. Let's keep going. So this is probably the main plank, the content strategy here. So as someone already pointed out, number 7, what I call omnibus preference. The preferencing and publication of review, meta-analysis, position papers, consortium papers, or anything else where you're talking about summary, because it has been established for about 20 years that citation behavior improves with access to summary items. Numerator hacking, someone also mentioned, and I'm probably most pleased that this was mentioned. Preferential publication of non-research items, which contribute to citations but are not deemed original research. So commentary, correspondence, community stuff, errata, letters to the editor, news, editorials, etc. Now there's 3 rules of thumb for including something in a journal and having it count towards the citation count but not count towards the denominator of that impact factor. Anything without an abstract, anything that's short, and anything that has a truncated reference list. Now, don't think it's an exact science, but in general, those seem to be the big levers that determine whether or not something is a research item that goes into the denominator of the impact factor calculation. We'll get back to that, believe me. So rejecting negative confirmatory or replication studies, it's very easy to do this. You simply say, well, it lacks novelty. The question's already been answered. Everyone is familiar with this. This has been very much an open science thing for the last decade. Please publish our replications. The replications are better quality than the original papers. We didn't find the fascinating, glowing, interesting effect from the first research. Well, if it's a really big one and it's going to make a lot of fuss and it's criticizing something in another journal, maybe you've got a better shot. But if it is a less fancy, but still accurate representation of a redo of a previous study within the journal, publication has always been difficult. And then, of course, there's ambulance chasing. You have a short-term topic, something becomes a topic du jour, get stuff on that. No matter what it is, doesn't matter. Okay, that's content. So combo plates are anything with a content and citation behavior thing at the same time. Editorial comments, which just so happen to cite everything in the issue. These are easy enough to find, but also at the same time, they're reasonably excusable. Self-referential commentary, discuss within journal articles, within things that you formally publish. Early on in my PhD, I wrote to a bunch of journals, not with what I ended up doing later in my scientific career, but with things that were more arguments about the content. And I was always surprised to find that they sailed straight in. I never got a lot of pushback for writing a letter to the editor and talking about the content. So let's argue about the content. Journals can be really quite forgiving when it comes to you sending those, because a lot of people don't take the time. But cynically, it's a free hit when it comes to whether or not the journal is successful. The response is not quite so positive when your letter to the editor contains information that invalidates the pre-existing research. Arguments are okay. Invalidations apparently are not. Let's quickly do author strategies and keep going. Network citations. People who write papers all the time will publish in your journal, and then they'll go and immediately publish someone else and then reference themselves. So accept their stuff. And preference, or sometimes go looking for publications from people with high profiles because they're high profile. Makes sense. Now, every single one of these things is not necessarily, except maybe for the citation cartel thing, every single one of these strategies is not necessarily an impact factor manipulation. It's just that they can be used to do that. Some equivalent of necessary but not sufficient, right? So those are the 14 strategies. That's how we're going to run our journal. We're going to pick a topic, and eventually we're going to, over a period of a couple of years, we're going to juice this impact factor until it looks better than everything else. If you do that, and the vast majority of people are not interested in these factors, you will quickly rise up the rank of whatever, and the publication in and of itself will be regarded as successful. But as you can imagine, if you run all of these in parallel, what you're producing doesn't really look like a journal anymore. So, quick note before we go on, none of this is new. I read a lot of the work of this gentleman Falagas. Both of these papers, as I said, a good 2/3 of the previous are drawn from these two papers. It is, it's very well established. It's not something that I came up with at all. That first one there, that's crucial. Publications without an abstract and or limited number of references, not included in the denominator, etc., etc. Okay, so that's pushing 15 years ago that was written down. On we go. So if we do all of these, we get to an interesting question. And it's, what is a journal actually, like, at its core? What is it supposed to do? Well, the basic definitions that trade between a journal and a predatory journal are actually really unclear on this. A permanent and transparent forum for the discussion of research, as in empirical research or reviews of empirical research, is the incredibly well established standard definition of what a journal is. But what's a predatory journal? Well, there was a big Nature consortium, a group of people who tried to come up with a definition for this. Prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship, and there are 4 things: false and misleading information, deviation from best editorial publication practices, lack of transparency, indiscriminate solicitation. Now, false and misleading information might be a bit harsh, and indiscriminate solicitation rather than targeted solicitation are obviously different. Everyone has had that email. Dear Mr. Dr. Heathers J.A. PhD, felicitations, etc. But those middle two, deviation from best editorial and publication practices and a lack of transparency, they become really interesting when we think about how we heavily manipulate an impact factor in a fancy journal. Because very clearly deprioritizing empirical work and publishing that is probably not a best editorial practice. And I've read a lot of editorials where about the middle of the year, about right now, actually, someone writes an editorial. The journal of whatever has gone from an impact factor of 2.5 to an impact factor of 3. What is never included after that is, and we deliberately wanted this, and we have our own internal strategies to increase our impact factor. Now, without getting to myself into any legal trouble here, I can assure you that some journals definitely do. They do. But they're not real keen on admitting it. And that, as a kind of guiding editorial policy that's not stated, especially in editorials that are literally about that, also strikes me as something that loads on the lack of transparency factor. So this put Beale's list and the whole idea of a bad journal, when I worked my way through this for the first time, into a whole new context, and the idea that there's good and bad pieces to these proceedings. It became much more of a continuum. Obviously, we can say that journals that have terrible or absent editorial control, who just publish whatever for money, are still obviously predatory. But all of the conflict that happened about a decade ago around how Beale's list was constructed traded on the publication practices of journals that are sort of halfway. That was where the conflict got started. And, well, let me put it in perspective for you. Because I have nothing better to do with my life, this is figures from a journal. Now, quickly before I start, Citations, numerator only. any small item that fits into the category of can accrue citations but is not a research object. Small number of citations itself, no abstract, short, mix up in a bucket. So this is a real journal. And these are the first 6 non-special issues from the calendar years 2010, 2015, 2020. I just started right at the beginning on January the 1st and kept going until we had 6 issues to include. It's approximately the same amount of articles in all of them. And you can see that this journal has gone from 8.5 research articles per issue to less than half and 3.5. And the number of sinos per issue has gone up by a factor of a hair over 6, from less than 1 to about 5. Now, at this point in time, you get to ask some really interesting questions, like, is this actually a journal anymore? I mean, you have more other items. It's less than 30% actual research. Is it still an academic journal? Well, you could strongly make the argument that it is. That it has a different kind of focus, that it's a community journal, that it's serving what people want, and that is being reflected in how the journal is being received. Because I assure you in this context, this is working. It's just raising an interesting question of, 1, is this something they're ever willing to talk about? And 2, how has it changed what this scholarship actually is when you're very successful journals are no longer really have any primacy at all on actually publishing research? This leads us to a really perverted conclusion, which is that some of the most successful journals do publish as little actual research as possible. Now, I mean, there's realistic exceptions to this being a problem. Obviously, journals that only publish reviews, which the vast majority, as far as I can tell, are quite sincere. They're not doing it because they think it's a good idea. I mean, some of them started 60, 70 years ago. So I don't think that before the impact factor existed. So the thesis has outlasted any of this. But for new journals, what this is telling us is that, at least in some cases, people will change the entire structure of what it is that they publish in order that it is seen as successful by this product. I said product instead of metric. You know what I did there? Okay. So they distort a lot. I have had a lot of fun conversations with open science people where their continual usage of outlets that give primacy to impact factor metrics and related things, I suppose. You know, there's incredibly sincere people who will look you right in the eye and say, well, I need it for the 10 years. This is how the 10 years is calculated. I need to publish in these journals anyway. Yes, I don't believe in it. Yes, you don't believe in it, but I have to do it because I have to. I can't let my principles affect my students' careers. That's the one I think I've heard the most. And I don't have any other options for this paper. There's only one specialty journal. It just happens to be a fancy journal, according to the impact factor. It has to go there. And some of my own papers, occasionally against my better judgment, have gone to fancier journals on the basis of, well, I don't believe in this stuff, but can we just do it anyway because it's there? Please, don't go all James on me. Just let me do this. It has to go somewhere. Why not the place with the fancy impact factor? Okay, fine. So come on, you. There you go. So let's chew through the concepts at the start now a little bit in the context of how these are deployed and how they kind of run the world. The impact factor is obviously a failed metric, but it's astonishingly good as a product. It's a very good digital product because it's been offered by a company and in a real sense as a strong proxy for quality or prestige. It's been accepted basically as a regulatory standard. I don't know if this is still the case, but that has been formalized in various European systems of adding up whether or not the publications from a work group or a university or a department are actually good Basically, just tally up the impact factors and do it that way. There used to be quality tiers in the Australian REF framework until Kim Carr changed them. We actually had a science minister who knew something about science. It's a rare unicorn, I assure you. That was about a decade ago, and those strongly tracked impact factors. And as much as this room is probably as derisive as me when it comes to do these things make sense, but I assure you that they are still very much a thing in the rest of the world, especially the rest of the world that doesn't have immediate access to the journals that have the particularly good ones. They're very much on a pedestal. So we have this proxy regulatory standard. It is professionally enforced by tenure. I have seen tenure dossiers, obviously, and how fancy the research is, even from reasonably progressive kinds of authors, how fancy the research is defined in this context and presented in this way. Even if people don't believe it themselves, there's still a sop to it. Grants is even worse. I've heard plenty of stories of grants getting shut down because the baseline work that the proposed new work was based upon is insufficiently fancy. And the insufficiently fancy is primarily, in some of those cases, defined by the impact factor. Likewise, with the enforcement of it and what success actually looks like, we also punish deviations from it. And it is very difficult to write open textbooks and produce software packages and be a particularly good teacher, have excellent pedagogy, etc. In a lot of academic careers, those are also ran categories. High impact factor research has career primacy over everything else. It's very difficult to pick any one of those other. It's reasonably straightforward to do nothing but high impact factor research and make progress in a particularly difficult academic environment at any point historically right now. Pick any other academic output, service, whatever, and just do that and see how well your tenure application goes. So we punish deviations from this. In one respect, it's really the only game in town. Now, this is starting to feel not the same, but very similar, very analogous to regulatory capture, in that there is a product that is being sold into this market, and the product is immediately related to the work of other people, and then they've accepted it as an enforcement themselves. There are some really interesting, I've heard some really fun stories about when it comes to how the numerator denominator pieces are calculated, the fancy EICs going to the Clarivat people at conferences or other contexts and having a discussion with them about, well, we have this particular article type and I don't think it should be counted in the denominator. Let's talk about exactly how we're going to perform the assessment of this. I love the idea that people are arguing themselves into a better impact factor because they have a publication type and it's the way it's calculated. That feels very much within the realm of regulatory capture. You're having a negotiation where the interests of the external company have become so important to you that you are trying to resolve. You're trying to resolve how what they're producing is being treated. So he said depressingly, come on slides, there you go. Journals obviously are run by academics and work to perpetuate it and actively pursue it. Examples just given. The part I find this is wonderfully fun and ironic is that there are probably people out there somewhere who have published work about how the impact factor is a terrible idea in an article that then has citations that is in a journal that has an impact factor, and then they've had to write down somewhere how successful that article called the impact factor is bullshit has been on the basis of its impact factor. You have to laugh a little bit. So we contain the criticisms of a metric like this within these journals. We publicize all its shortcomings. There's a good Ioannidis paper from 2019 about changing this for swapping the impact factor out for the median citation index. And then, of course, we use it anyway. Read his or anyone else's bio, and I assure you that the influence will be apparent. And of course, there's dozens of other metrics. Everyone's somewhat familiar with the eigenvalues and the everything else. There's a bucket, and we use this one anyway, even though a lot of the others are free and straightforward and easy to calculate. It's become part of the landscape in a way that we can't seem to be able to unravel. So get to something slightly different here as a sort of a jumping off point. Into this environment, which is obviously showing very strong elements of a certain kind of bureaucratism, I now meet a lot of people who wish to start small organizations, small commercial organizations. And in general, they have proposals to change things like this. Not necessarily come up with a new impact factor, come up with a new publication system, come up with a new journal system, but a lot of them are very good at the technical construction of what they do. And I think the vast majority of their companies will die. In general, they make three mistakes. They try to do everything at once. I'm going to create myself a new global publication system. They fail to appreciate both the human factors and the fact that people obviously need to be sold on this. You're taking people who have been captured by this environment and tremendously large bureaucracies as governments and universities. And you're trying to mash them all. You're trying to mash it all together. And feel like that your small company can navigate this and convince everyone it's a better idea. The last problem, of course, is that they have no idea who their customers are, who's actually going to pay them. I had some really depressing conversations with people who have great ideas to innovate within publication space. And I get the strong impression they don't have the slightest idea who's going to pay for their idea, because obviously none of it is free. I mean, a lot of it can be done really cheaply, and a lot more cheaply than other people will tell you. But there's still no understanding of how they're going to fit within how heavily bureaucratized this entire environment actually is. So it's an incredibly difficult innovation space as well. And I suppose I'm telling you this particular slide because it's the answer to the question of why won't this go away? Why can't we change it? Well, this is the experience of people who are trying to. I love these companies. I hope they do well. I like the people who run them. I just generally have fairly black thoughts about whether or not they'll be able to succeed in that endeavor. There are, of course, plenty of companies within academic space who have managed to find customers, get a business model together that makes sense, identify recurring revenue streams, etc. And almost invariably, those are service companies. They're doing something for you. They're not trying to change components of the landscape. They're selling you a particular service within the context of you doing what you already do. They're not trying to change that. So this would be the point in any normal presentation where I start finishing off with things like, "Don't worry, everything's perfectly okay. Here are the positive signs in the distance. You know, there's no cause for despair." Well, I rarely think there's cause for a despair, but I certainly don't have a positive closer. These are the only conclusions that I feel is responsible to draw. Also, I hate false optimism, so we're not doing it. No phrase in academia is more dangerous than "we should." There's been 1,000 discussions about this in a variety of different contexts. The moment you find yourself saying, "Do you know what would be a good idea?" There's no point even finishing the sentence, frankly. The levers that we need to pull and the amount of effort that will go into the dissemination of said idea about changing how all of this is structured. Save the oxygen, basically. Don't make the trees work any harder than they have to. The second point here is probably the only real advice I've got. Make a plan to leave. I'm not saying leave. I hope your career goes as well as humanly possible. Better than mine did, certainly. As much as there is a tremendous amount of mental and emotional comfort in knowing that you've got another option. Figure out what that option is. Get some experience within it that makes it feel more viable. Keep it as a plan B in your head. Know what it is. Figure it out. There almost always is. I'm starting to see more and more a lot of people, especially here in the US, a lot of people whose work that I respect, leaving and going into various industry contexts, and people who are the strong traditional academia. When I left, I had the most extraordinary private response to that experience. And a lot of it was not from people who are the traditionally marginalized ECR kind of cats. A lot of it was from people who you might think were successfully doing the science thing, successful academics. There's a tremendous amount of curiosity around the process. And the thing that I've started noticing about people who are very good who are leaving is that they are leaving to do something that is very close to their academic work. Someone who runs a company for money, looking at what they do and figuring out a way that they can do that there. It's not a matter of, you know, I have a degree in X, but now I alphabetize insurance forms. It's not that. It's a gradual encroachment on a kind of a skill base in a way where the transfer of skills is starting to become more straightforward. It's not like people who are great physicists going to work in finance at Wall Street. It's not like that at all. They just want them because they have the computational chops. They're not interested in the physics. It's more like a direct transfer. So I'll finish with two questions that probably feel a little bit out of place on this slide now. One, what allows innovation? And two, who is the customer? When it comes to making decisions about how to navigate the tomfuckery, I feel like the question, what allows innovation? Where am I allowed to change something? Where do I have an interface with a structure or an idea or a place for me that allows me to change things? In general, that feels like a good decision. It's something that I've seen work for people. And it's a place where you have options, where you're not really subject to what economists would call a dualized labor market. And the fact that there's insiders and outsiders. The nexus between insiders and outsiders is the ability to innovate locally. So anytime someone allows you to change it, I think a really good instinct is to head towards what you're allowed to be able to change. And always throughout all of this, think about the answer to the question, who is the customer? If I'm writing something, if I'm reading something, if I have access to something for papers, for journals, for systems, for conferences, always think, who is the customer? Who's paying? And that keeps you grounded. That's all I got.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, James. That was an absolutely wonderful talk. There's a horrible echo, and nobody needs to hear my Black Country accent as an echo. I think that's sorted out. So I'm going to hand you over to the capable hands of Ian, who I think should be there. If you want to unmute yourself, Ian, there you are. So just before I go, everybody, you can put questions to James in the Q&A and make sure to upvote them, and we'll prioritize the ones that are most popular. So yes, thank you again, James. Unfortunately, I have to go. I have another talk. So Ian, I'll leave it over to you.
Thanks, Sam.
Hey, Ian, yes. I can see these questions. I can just save you the trouble if you want and rattle them off.
Oh, that's perfect, because, you know, I'll probably mess them up anyway, James. So do you want to start with the first one then?
Yeah, well, should we start at the top and go the whole way down?
Perfect.
Okay, one thing from the way the impact factors are restructured, I guess number one is defunct apart from this year. Who else is looking forward to the massive drops next year? That's going to be really interesting, actually. The present impact factor calculations are going to hoover in all the things that are being online published now that were originally designed to be formal publications later. So they're going to go up, and then they're going to go crashing down on the other side. And it's going to affect very little, but people are going to talk about it heaps. It will be a little bit funny. And I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens to the 2021 versions. I mean, some credit to them, at least. I mean, it's you can obviously see what I think now about the kind of the utility, whether or not this particular business model is just parasitic and ridiculous. But credit to them for actually doing something parasitism regardless. Neil Martin, UK ref has twigged and does not consider the impact factor or any other metric as a determination of quality. At least this is what its guidance says. Yes, a lot of broader formal systems in English-speaking countries where research systems are populated by the reasonably sophisticated are doing things like that. Like I said, Australia did it 10 years ago. This in no way, when it comes to the formal governmental level of assessment, you can take the number out, but the fanciness of something that is an echo of it still very much stays behind. And you also, I mean, there's a lot of different grant schemes in a lot of different places. And trust me, when it comes to the anonymous responses of someone to what is actually inside your grant, you will still see the long echoes of this. I should have hoovered up some stories. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare this. Startup Life does not really give you a great deal of, I'm less focused than I normally would be. Startup Life does not give you a great deal of free time to be able to cogitate. And one thing I would have loved to have done is to get better stories about the impact factor to ground this for people who aren't immediately familiar with it. If you were going to start a journal, what would you name it? Preferably one word name. I would probably call it something that was that made it sound particularly anodyne before I did horrible things with it. So I would pick something like Scion or maybe Ultima. And then I would immediately proceed to use to break the shins of people that I didn't like, which is why no one lets me start a journal. Can you give examples of companies that are going to fail? That's really mean. No. I mean, I don't have a lot of appreciation for etiquette, he said in his favorite jungle rot shirt. I think that is, as a category, anything that is looking at the macro factors within the publication industry that are trying to replace how the sort of 4 odd centuries of how we construct academic discourse. Anyone who's trying to throw that away, in general, the battle that they face, considering how we formalize and assess and disseminate and grade the work that we do, the uphill battle. I mean, they think it's going to be hard. It's going to be so much harder than that. Journal name El Dorado. I like it. That's okay. However, it's 2 words, and that ruins the content from the previous question. Is there actually demand from academics to change impact factors? It's just too practical and easy for use for boomers who don't want to read papers, CVs. There is. I think a lot of it is confined to the sort of bibliometrics and scientometric community, who have a reasonable amount of contempt for it in a lot of different contexts. But in general, look, this is one of the elements of regulatory capture. Why would we change it when it's okay? There's so many. I must have read many dozens of times something like, the impact factor is toilet, but we still use it because it's there. And then they proceed to talk about how it works now and what's happened. You know, it's just one of those things. It's one of the teach the controversy kinds of moments where people manage to like pull it into what they're talking about, accept the criticisms, and then pretend the criticisms don't exist and use it anyway. That's good fun. I'm not cynical. If you want to drop anything else in the old Q&As there, That's perfectly okay. Oh yes, someone has posted a Bjorn Brem's a blog post about impact factor negotiations. Yes, he has a couple of really good publications of the impact factor that are about 5 years old, or is it just one? I can't remember. There's at least one. Definitely worth your time. I remember reading that a while ago. How can we get impact factor calculators to include open science stuff? You can't. Download Citation, the free preprint version of the article. What is in this is not our intellectual property. This is owned by someone. What it is, how it's represented, the whole idea that they're going to change it and come up with impact factor 2.0 or even more impact factor 2, Return of the Snake, I don't know, whatever the hell it is. They won't do that. Their intellectual property and their focus is organized around this being important in and of itself. Its longevity is important to the central business thesis of a company. They won't change it to put things that you want into it. Now you can come up with your own metric. You just then have to convince a whole lot of people who it's working for that your metric needs to be valued the same way. And trust, there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of others. There's a lot of different ways of saying how successful is this paper, how successful is this journal, etc. A lot of them aren't particularly sophisticated. In general, they're just different numerical methods of adding up the same stuff. A lot of them are reflective of each other. There are problems with it that's never going to go away. But in general, you can't. Sorry. Now, download Citations, the free preprint version of the article. This is actually a really interesting one. The impact factor people have had tremendous difficulty before about different versions of the same article being in different places, and that is a lot of the time preprint and then online publication and then formal publication. Like how do we mash it all together? There's something on the Scholarly Kitchen website, which I have frequently derided, but also frequently they publish good and relevant stuff in amongst the things that drive me completely crazy. You can read about it there. It's about a few days back. There's a good perspective on that there. Okay, in certain countries, every 5 years, a committee of researchers evaluate labs and base their evaluations which labs have the right to continue to exist. What could we answer them? Super difficult. You see how big the levers are that need to be pulled when it comes to something like this. I mean, you're talking essentially about a change in government policy, a change in university policy. Overarching research frameworks, a lot of the time, are very big, and they involve a lot of multiple parties at a generally a multi-billion-dollar level across organizations and governments. How they organize what they measure and try to be able to systematize it is difficult with good metrics, let alone with bad metrics. As a policy prediction, but prescription, I suppose, a policy prescription for something like that, honestly, I'm coming up dry. Frankly, I don't know if this person is an ECR. The best thing I can say is get the money, wait a decade, and then see what you can do to change it. There's universities and governments and journals, trust me, as someone who's asked them occasionally difficult questions, are famously resistant to having a conversation about anything. So I don't know, man. I'm sorry if that's a bleak answer. Best of luck. What could a good approach be while considering their opinion to determine my lab durability? I'm sorry, Cyril. I don't have any follow-on, etc. I just don't know. Do you have any key bits of advice for ECRs who want to make academia a better place for ourselves and our colleagues, particularly when contracts are short and there's pressure to publish in high impact factor journals, whether you want to or not? It is tricky when you have to bide your time and then end up falling into the same trap. That's a damn good question. In general, I would say the vast majority of the time, if you're going to get into the fancy impact factor space, it doesn't preclude a lot of regular modern open science practices. The vast majority of these journals, especially within, I take it that a lot of people here are from the are not from the sort of life or the hard sciences traditions. That we're somewhere within the broader social scientific framework-ish. You are still allowed to preprint. You're still allowed to give away your data. You're still allowed to show people your code. You're still allowed to sign your reviews, etc. Normalize that. And when other people do it, engage with it. I found it really difficult to sort of, in my work, preferentially reward other people doing this when it came to my sort of formal research. It's very hard to go out and help. I mean, you could always start a journal with a brilliant impact factor. I've given you the template for that now. Yeah, what you're referring to, I mean, this is the whole idea of capture in this context is really interesting. The key phrase I think that you need to Google to be able to understand how this transition occurs is dualized labor market. Now, a quick foray into economics because it's fun. In general, when people talk about a dualized labor market, they mean the difference between the dude who owns the farm and gets 3 million euros in subsidies and the poor motherfuckers who are out there picking up the actual potatoes who never managed to work their way into having any equity in the farm itself. You know, it's not a cooperative. There's no ownership that's given. You're talking about people who own an asset and then people who work on the asset, right? Academia is really interesting because you have a very strongly dualized labor market, but you also have the people who are the traditional outsider role here are often not only deeply skilled, but doing all the work. So unless you can organize a globalized labor movement, we're going to have to change the levers. And this I cannot look from a business perspective, but see things all the time and talk to people and have an appreciation of different things where people are saying, hey, we can innovate within this particular space. And you give them 3 months and suddenly, boom, everything is different. This is happening a lot like financial services right now. SaaS companies, which is software as a service, there's been really interesting companies in the last couple of years where they basically take all the regulatory structure of what other people have to do. This happens in law and local government and all manner of sort of civic life. And they say, this normally takes you to do your compliance training for the people who are in your organization. We'll take all of that away. We'll make this thing that's a huge pain in your ass, we'll change it all completely, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's a new de facto standard. And suddenly everyone is using that thing. People do that every single day in commercial life. And they would almost never in academia. It's a really, really interesting dichotomy. In general, some people like me have problems with attention and usually have a sort of brain to mouth disparity and thrive on novelty and everything changing all the time. If that's you, take a sabbatical and try working at a small commercial organization. It is not the painful experience you think it might be. There are elements within it you won't enjoy, but you can say that about anything. I strongly recommend it as an experience. Oh, this is. It's always good to have a question that includes BAF in the first line. I'm in middle management in a university, BAF. Supposedly our uni will no longer use these metrics in hiring or promotion. Okay, would it be awful to run an analysis on successful applicants in this round to see if this is the case? And if it is, screen the place down asking for a friend. No, it wouldn't be awful at all. Because that would be a really interesting reflection on how this works as an implicit standard. As an explicit standard, obviously everyone can point to it and go, that thing there, that explicit standard is incredibly straightforward. Now, I'm not drawing a direct moral comparison between these things, but there are plenty of examples where you say, hey, these people in our country were a sort of a permanent underclass by law. And then you change the law and you say, okay, now it's illegal to do a discrimination. You may not do that anymore. What do you get on the other side of that? Jim Crow. You get situations where exactly the same people who are in charge come up with a different and somewhat informal, somewhat formal, kind of translates into exactly the same thing without actually saying it, perspective on managing the same thing in the same way. Now, like I said, there's no, don't quote me as saying there's a direct moral equivalence. I'm saying that a lot of the time when you take away an explicit barrier, where an explicit edict that says use these things, other systems that are informal or are less focused arise to take its place. So let's say we throw away all the impact factors completely. And then we say something like must have evidence of high level research over time. And then we leave that open. You think a great deal is going to change? If we say your paper in a community journal or your paper in a society journal that is legit, genuinely interesting, that everyone in your field likes, that has more citations than all the other ones, is it going to receive the same perspective than the big fancy thing? So you can take these things away, but I don't think that scares the people who own the metrics. I'm repeating myself, they are a product. I don't think that scares them at all. I think these will still be used, this and everything like it, right? I think that will still be bought and used as a product to handle the macro sort of dean scale decisions about what department do we move there and how do we give them money, and the governmental decisions that, you know, do you get to be a university, you get to be a community college, whatever. They are baked in. This is the whole point about regulatory capture. You change the explicit barrier and then people will just go around making it explicit for themselves. He said depressingly. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't mean to be a downer. It's just that there is a lot to be concerned about. And that is why the second last sentence on those slides basically says move towards innovation. If you see a place where that's changing, a field springs up and all of a sudden you're not beholden to, because it's some completely new thing, no one's ever heard of it, there's no journals. Right? You get to do that. There's a corporate outreach, whatever initiative where you start working with an external party and you start generating things that are of different value, do that. There's a possibility to get a 5-year grant to make training materials or something like that. You don't have to publish papers on it. You have to actually publish the thing themselves. Superb, do that. Anytime you're in charge of the definition of something is a place where you have the ability to flex. Head towards that, like a moth to a bug light, because that is a place where you can, well, you can't write your own check, but at the very least you can come up with your own definitions. And I strongly recommend that as a way of being able to move forward. Oh, I think I got them all.
Perfect. Oh, I'm echoing. Oh. Thanks a million for that, James. Beautiful talk. Okay. I've got a question, but you know we'll be respectful of your time. I know Phil from Cypher Skin wants to see you.
No, fuck my time. We're here now. There's still people. Let's go. Let's get rid of them.
Right. Well, this is probably one of the longest we've done so far, anyway. So
good.
It's been. Do you want one more? Should we do one more?
Yeah. Have you got them? Oh. Come on, man. There's 37 people watching, Ian. Pressure's on you, pal.
Oh, geez, don't say that. Well, Sam has left some questions. Sam wants to know your thoughts on self-plagiarism. Said, should we reword text to avoid duplication, or should we duplicate so it is transparent that duplication took place?
Jesus. Well, that is almost entirely unrelated to everything I've just said.
Skip that one.
Language,
Second one, James. Then.
Language is important, and self-plagiarism is still silly according to the words themselves. It's text recycling. You can't rip yourself off. There should be a simple way of delineating in text the fact that text has come from somewhere else that's not annoying. Put it in a text box. Use different I don't know. Use different format in context. You did the method exactly the same way, but the method needs to be included in the paper. Shit, gray out the background, because there's nothing more annoying than this method is exactly the same as the previous thing. You go looking for the previous thing, you can't find the damn thing. You're interfering with people's ability to read a document. But at the same time, reproducing things exactly, even if they were done in exactly the same way and you described it well previously, leaves you open to accusations that you're ripping yourself off and being a lazy academic. All you really need to do is figure out a way to gray the background. God damn it. You go through, cite yourself, exactly the same as Lahart 2017. Here's all the text from that, gray it or block quote it, or just make a delineation. We know how to quote stuff. People tie themselves in knots over things that can be handled by typesetting.
You know, as you said earlier, that to the question that you asked, and a lot of the responses were kind of negative and how we can kind of rig the impact factor. If we kind of flip that a little bit in terms of, okay, forget about the impact factor and you were setting up a new journal, what things would you do, that you think would improve the state of science?
What would I do?
You didn't care about the impact factor, but you're setting up a new journal. What would you do? Okay, here's the first thing I do. I pick a field that really needed it, and I would go out, and the very first thing that I would do is assemble a crew, and then I would try and find a grant that was explicitly designed to support this thing behind my radical concept. Journal management systems aren't free. I mean, they can be real cheap now, but they aren't free. People's time is not free. No one wants to do copy editing for free. Copy editing is a job. Software management is a job. Database architecture is a job. This is, you can't, I mean, a lot of academic like fanciful ideas often revolve around, well, if we can just get everyone to do this for nothing, we can have anything we want. No. Stop thinking like that. It's not going to work. Find someone who's progressive in a foundation, or someone who's interested in publishing, or approach a publisher themselves. Just don't give them any goddamn editorial control, and find the money and organize the money behind your idea for being able to do things radically. Okay, second thing, the whole idea of, there's huge problems with the basic ideas of, like, how do we run an open access journal where we publish something for money? There's problems with the incentives. There's problems with how the things themselves are structured. It becomes very, very difficult. I would strongly preference running a fairly heavily curated. Yes, it's possible to do that and still have a reflection on the quality of the articles themselves, especially if it's within a particular niche. A lot of the time you'll find that takes care of itself. It's much more difficult. It's infinitely more difficult to do a PLOS 1 journal than the Journal of Incredibly Focused Analytical Tomfuckery. That, as an intellectual endeavor, is hella possible to curate. PLOS 1, completely different animal. The ability to get the right people in front of the right thing. You're essentially making for yourself a gigantic curation problem. And the broader you go, the harder that's going to be. So you pick the right goddamn area, because that allows you to genuinely exercise real quality control over some of it. And that's not to say everything shouldn't be published. Everything can be published. Preprint that shit. That's fine. Okay, it's out there. But, I don't owe you a cookie. You have to, there are things within this that need to be maintained. I mean, I've found it very funny previously when people are like, everything should be published. I'm owed access rights to this journal. You can't throw it away just because you don't like it. And at the same time, they'll turn around the next day and go, oh, I read this paper and look at the methods. The methods are complete garbage, and I can prove it to you beyond a shadow of a doubt. How do you reconcile those two things? Yeah? Anyway, so we got that out of the way. That, look, it's also possible to
support and promote the things that you publish and to put them in the right context and put them in front of people in the traditional way. Marketing. That's what it essentially amounts to. Marketing, SEO, focus. Take the right stuff to the right conferences, stick it in front of the right people, promote basically the assets that you have. I mean, I know that using this language makes people uncomfortable, but please realize that a lot of the time this is what this amounts to, is that people promote their own stuff because they genuinely do think it's good stuff. And that comes to things that they publish and also things that they write themselves. I mean, I've got papers I prefer never to think about again just because they're sort of emotionally unsatisfying. But I've got other ones where I think I did a really good job on that. And I'll be very happy to send that to people. The other thing that you want to do is, like I said, think about who's the customer. If you treat the submitting party as a customer, for you, the journal, you are actually doing a different thing than other journals, because the customers a lot of the time are people who buy access in the traditional journal publishing model. In open access, people are paying you. It's a service model. People are paying you to look at your stuff and publish it, etc., etc., and you're paying them, right? If you're paying them, are you a customer? No. Have the right amount of support and be able to set that up where people send you something. Not only do you have the resources to get to it quickly and be able to make a sensible decision about it, but you don't have any of the other the fucking typesetting rules. Don't. Citation format rules. Don't. Fucking all the copy editing. Don't. In any given, this is so far from the kind of Kaizen, Six Sigma kind of shit that people in companies go on about every day, but they do have a point. Yeah? I mean, you can dress it up with any fancy corporate gibberish you want, but you're actually focused on the experience of the people who are sending you the papers. I think there's a huge undifferentiated ability to do a successful journal. We are actually taking care of the people who are sending you the material. Have you had an experience with a journal that's so bad that if you knew you could have a better one somewhere else, you wouldn't change it? You probably would if it was good enough, right? And the final thing, and I hate saying this, but it's still true, is this whole traditional game, yeah, you're going to have to go out and get an impact factor, or the people who don't agree with us are never going to fuck with you. You're going to have to go and do that. That is something that's going to have to happen. Otherwise, you are going to restrict your focus to everyone who agrees with you. Big tent stuff is annoying. It's annoying in politics, it's annoying in civics, it's annoying in academia, that you have to mess with people you don't necessarily agree with. Yeah, but I mean, it's their scientific commons too. You're going to have to get an impact factor. You're going to have to think about maintaining it. And if you're going to do any of those 14 things, actually don't do any of those 14 things, but do realize that what you're doing loads on how successful that is. Maybe you can think of it as a fringe benefit, but okay, I'm really running on this one. Sorry, Ian.
Excellent. Right, I think we'll leave it there, James. That's excellent. Thanks so much for giving your time to us.
That's all right.
And presenting today. So I think that's it. Gurav Mila Monica and Salana. See you later.
Oh yeah. I'll